Sarah Martinez had always found peace in the methodical rhythm of cleaning firearms. The small workshop behind her father's gun shop in rural Montana smelled of gun oil and metal polish, scents that had become as familiar as her morning coffee. At 28, she had spent more hours with firearms than most people spend watching television. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows as Sarah disassembled a custom rifle that belonged to a local rancher. Her hands moved with practiced precision, each motion deliberate and careful. She had learned this craft from her father, who had learned it from his father before him. 3 generations of Martinez family members had built their reputation on meticulous craftsmanship and an almost supernatural understanding of firearms. What made Sarah different from her father and grandfather was not just her gender, but her uncanny ability to understand the personality of each weapon that crossed her workbench. She could tell within minutes of handling a rifle whether it would shoot true or if something was off in its balance or mechanics. Local hunters often joked that Sarah could make a broken gun shoot straighter than a brand new one fresh from the factory. The bell above the front door chimed, signaling a customer had entered the shop. Sarah heard her father's muffled voice greeting someone, followed by footsteps that seemed more purposeful than those of their usual clientele. Most customers shuffled or wandered, taking time to browse the displays of hunting rifles and ammunition. These footsteps had military precision to them. She continued working on the rifle, running a cleaning rod through the barrel with smooth strokes. The weapon was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, a bolt-action rifle with a custom stock that had been carved to fit its owner's specific measurements. Sarah had worked on this particular gun several times, and she knew its quirks better than most people knew their own cars. The footsteps approached the workshop door, and Sarah looked up to see a man in his early 40s standing in the doorway. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors in harsh conditions. His clothing was civilian, but everything about his posture and the way his eyes quickly scanned the room told Sarah he was military or former military. "You must be Sarah," the man said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Your father mentioned you do the precision work around here." Sarah set down the cleaning rod and wiped her hands on a shop towel. "That's right. What can I do for you?" The man stepped into the workshop, and Sarah noticed he moved with the kind of controlled grace that came from years of tactical training. His eyes immediately went to the rifle she was working on, and she saw a flicker of professional interest cross his face. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said, extending a hand. "I was hoping you might take a look at something for me." Sarah shook his hand, noting the calluses that suggested he spent considerable time handling weapons. "What kind of something?" Jake reached into a long case he had been carrying and withdrew a rifle that made Sarah's breath catch in her throat. It was a custom long-range precision rifle. The kind of weapon that cost more than most people's cars. The scope alone probably cost more than her monthly salary. "This is my work rifle," Jake said, setting it carefully on Sarah's workbench. "She's been giving me some inconsistency issues at extreme range." Sarah examined the weapon without touching it. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, clearly the work of a master gunsmith. The barrel was heavy and fluted, designed for maximum accuracy over long distances. The stock was adjustable, and the trigger assembly was custom work that probably cost thousands of dollars. "What kind of ranges are we talking about?" Sarah asked. Jake's expression became slightly guarded. "Let's just say farther than most people shoot." Sarah nodded, understanding that some questions were better left unasked. She had worked on weapons for law enforcement and military personnel before, and she had learned that discretion was as important as skill in her line of work. She picked up the rifle, surprised by its weight and balance. Even without looking through the scope, she could tell this was a weapon designed for precision work at distances that would challenge even expert marksmen. The action was smooth as silk, and the trigger broke cleanly with minimal pressure. "Mind if I ask what branch you're with?" Sarah said, continuing her examination of the rifle. "Was with," Jake corrected. Special operations. 22 years. These days I do contract work. Sarah nodded again. She had suspected as much. The rifle in her hands was not the kind of weapon carried by regular infantry or even most military snipers. This was the tool of someone who specialized in shots that others would consider impossible. As she worked, Sarah became aware that Jake was watching her with intense attention. It was not the casual observation of a customer waiting for service, but the focused study of someone evaluating her competence. She had experienced this before with military clients who needed to be convinced that a young woman could understand their specialized weapons. "Your father tells me you're quite a shot yourself," Jake said after several minutes of silence. Sarah looked up from the rifle. "I do okay. He mentioned you won the state championship 3 years running." "That was a long time ago," Sarah said, though she felt a small surge of pride. Those championships had been among the happiest memories of her youth. Competing against seasoned marksmen and proving that skill mattered more than age or gender. Jake leaned against the workbench, his posture relaxed but his eyes still alert. "What's the longest shot you've ever made?" Sarah considered the question. In competitions, the longest distance had been 200 meters, a shot that had required her to calculate wind speed, humidity, altitude, and a dozen other factors. But she had made longer shots during practice sessions in the mountains behind her family's property. 1,500 meters, she said finally. In practice, not competition. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. That's impressive. Most people can't reliably hit targets beyond 1,000 meters. Most people don't spend every weekend practicing in the mountains, Sarah replied. She returned her attention to the rifle, noting several areas where the action could be improved. The weapon was well maintained, but she could see signs of heavy use and the kind of wear that came from field conditions rather than range shooting. "I can have this ready for you by tomorrow afternoon," Sarah said. "The issues you're having are minor, but they'll definitely affect consistency at long range." Jake nodded, but he seemed to be considering something. "Sarah, can I ask you a hypothetical question?" "Shoot," she said, then smiled at her own unintentional pun. "If someone wanted to test your skills at an extreme distance, say something well beyond what you've done in competition, would you be interested?" Sarah set down the rifle and looked at Jake carefully. There was something in his tone that suggested this was not entirely hypothetical. "Depends on what you mean by extreme distance," she said. Jake was quiet for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. "I'm talking about a shot that would challenge even experienced military snipers. A shot that most people would consider impossible." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She had always wondered how her skills would measure against truly elite marksmen, but she had never had the opportunity to find out. "How extreme are we talking?" she asked. Jake smiled for the first time since entering the workshop. "More extreme than you've ever imagined." 3 days later, Sarah found herself driving up a winding mountain road in Jake's military surplus pickup truck, her stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. After their conversation in the workshop, Jake had returned the next day with a proposal that had seemed almost surreal. "I want to see if you can make a shot at 3,800 meters, he had said simply. "That's about 2¼ miles. Sarah had nearly laughed at what seemed like an impossible challenge. The longest confirmed sniper shot in military history had been made at distances approaching that range, achieved by elite operators using specialized equipment under perfect conditions. The idea that she, a small-town gunsmith's daughter, could attempt such a shot seemed absurd. But something in Jake's expression had told her he was completely serious. Now, as they drove deeper into the Montana wilderness, Sarah was beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had agreed to attempt. Jake had spent 2 days preparing for this test, checking weather conditions, calculating ballistics, and scouting locations, with the methodical precision of someone who had planned similar operations in hostile territory. The truck rounded a final bend and emerged into a high mountain meadow surrounded by peaks that stretched toward the horizon. Jake parked near a cluster of boulders that provided natural cover and windbreak. The elevation here was over 8,000 feet, and the thin air made Sarah slightly lightheaded. "This is it," Jake said, climbing out of the truck. Sarah stepped into the crisp mountain air and immediately understood why Jake had chosen this location. The meadow offered an unobstructed view across a vast valley to the opposite ridgeline. The distance was staggering, so far that details on the far mountains were lost in atmospheric haze. Jake began unloading equipment from the truck bed, including his custom rifle, a sophisticated spotting scope, and electronic devices that Sarah had never seen before. Everything was contained in military-grade cases designed to protect precision instruments from harsh conditions. "The target is on that ridgeline," Jake said, pointing across the valley. "See that white rock formation about halfway up the slope?" Sarah squinted through the morning light, barely able to make out the pale stone outcropping Jake was indicating. It looked impossibly far away, like something she might view through binoculars while hiking, not something she could reasonably expect to hit with a rifle. "You're serious about this?" she said, more to herself than to Jake. "Dead serious," he replied, setting up the spotting scope. "But before we start, I need you to understand something. This is not just about marksmanship. At this distance, you're dealing with physics that most shooters never encounter." Jake began explaining the complexities involved in ultra-long-range shooting. At 3,800 meters, the bullet would be in flight for nearly 6 seconds. During that time, it would drop more than 400 feet due to gravity, requiring an enormous elevation adjustment. Wind would push the projectile off course by dozens of feet, if not properly calculated. Even the rotation of the Earth would affect the bullet's trajectory over such a distance. "The bullet will slow down significantly during flight," Jake continued, adjusting the spotting scope. "It starts supersonic but will probably go subsonic before impact, which affects its stability and accuracy." Sarah listened intently, trying to absorb information that was far beyond anything she had learned in competition shooting. Jake explained how atmospheric pressure, humidity, and temperature would all influence the shot. He showed her handheld devices that measured wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, since the wind conditions where they stood might be completely different from conditions the bullet would encounter during its long flight. "The most challenging part," Jake said, "is that at this distance, you can't spot your own shots. If you miss, you might not even know where the bullet went. That's why I'm here with the spotting scope." Sarah examined Jake's rifle more carefully than she had in the workshop. Now she understood why it was built with such precision. The scope was a work of art in itself, with adjustment knobs that allowed for minute changes in aim. The barrel was designed to minimize vibration and heat distortion. Every component was engineered for accuracy that most shooters would never need. Jake had set up a shooting position between two large rocks that provided stability and wind protection. He laid out a thick mat and adjusted a bipod to the exact height needed. The shooting position faced directly across the valley toward the distant target. "Before you even touch the rifle," Jake said, "we need to verify our calculations." He spent the next hour making observations and calculations, using instruments to measure atmospheric conditions and consulting ballistics charts on a tablet computer. Sarah watched the methodical process, realizing that successful long-range shooting was as much science as it was marksmanship skill. Finally, Jake announced that he was ready to let Sarah attempt the shot. As she settled into the shooting position, the weight and balance of the rifle felt different from her own weapons. The scope was more powerful than anything she had used, and when she looked through it, the distant rock formation suddenly seemed much closer, though still impossibly small. "The target is a rock about the size of a dinner plate," Jake said, looking through his spotting scope. I can just barely make it out from here. Sarah adjusted her position, trying to find the natural point of aim that would allow her to hold steady. At this distance, even the smallest movement would translate to a miss measured in yards rather than inches. Her heartbeat seemed loud in the thin mountain air, and she could feel her pulse in her fingertips where they touched the rifle. "Breathe normally," Jake coached. "Don't hold your breath for the shot. At this distance, oxygen is your friend." Sarah found the target through her scope, a pale spot among the rocky outcroppings across the valley. It looked absurdly small and far away, challenging every assumption she had about what was possible with a rifle. She began to understand why Jake had called this shot extreme, even by military standards. "Wind is steady from the left at about 12 miles per hour, Jake reported. "I've already adjusted the scope for the basic ballistics, but you'll need to hold about 8 feet to the right to compensate for wind drift." 8 feet. Sarah tried to visualize holding that far off target, trusting calculations and experience rather than her instincts. In normal shooting, aiming that far off target would feel completely wrong. She settled deeper into the shooting position, letting her body relax into the natural alignment that would give her the best chance of success. The rifle felt solid and comfortable, despite being heavier than what she was used to. Through the scope, she could see heat waves rising from the valley floor, creating slight distortions in her view of the target. "Take your time," Jake said quietly. "There's no rush. When you're ready, just squeeze straight back on the trigger." Sarah took a breath, held it briefly, then exhaled slowly while applying steady pressure to the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding mountains, the sound seeming tiny in the vast wilderness. The recoil was substantial but manageable, and Sarah quickly tried to get back on target to observe the impact. "I can't see anything," she said after several seconds of scanning through her scope. Jake was silent, studying the distant target through his much more powerful spotting scope. Sarah waited, her heart pounding with anticipation and nervous energy. After what felt like an eternity, Jake spoke. "I see dust," he said simply. "You hit the rocks about 15 feet low and maybe 20 feet to the left." Sarah felt a mixture of disappointment and amazement. She had missed by a significant margin, but the bullet had actually reached the intended area after traveling more than 2 miles. For her first attempt at such an extreme distance, simply getting close seemed like an accomplishment. "Want to try again?" Jake asked, already making adjustments to the scope. Sarah nodded, feeling more confident now that she had a sense of what to expect. The miss had given them valuable information about wind conditions and ballistics that could be used to improve the next shot. As Jake worked on the scope adjustments, Sarah reflected on the incredible complexity of what they were attempting. This was shooting at a level that pushed the boundaries of what was humanly possible, requiring not just marksmanship, but also advanced knowledge of physics, meteorology, and ballistics. The second shot felt different from the moment Sarah settled into position. Jake had made several adjustments to the scope based on her first attempt, and the wind had shifted slightly, requiring new calculations. This time, Sarah felt more connected to the rifle, more aware of her breathing and heartbeat, more attuned to the subtle environmental factors that could affect the shot. "Winds dropped to about 8 miles per hour, Jake reported, his voice quiet but confident. "I've adjusted for the bullet drop we observed. This time, hold about 6 feet right of target." Sarah aligned the crosshairs with her aiming point, fighting every instinct that told her she was pointing the rifle in the wrong direction. Trusting Jake's calculations meant aiming at empty air beside the target and believing that physics would guide the bullet to the correct impact point. She controlled her breathing, letting her natural respiratory pause dictate the timing of the shot. As her lungs reached their natural empty point, she applied steady pressure to the trigger. The rifle fired again, and this time Sarah felt more confident in her technique. Through the spotting scope, Jake watched for impact. The seconds stretched endlessly as the bullet crossed the vast distance between them and the target. Sarah held her breath, watching through her own scope for any sign of success or failure. "Hit!" Jake suddenly exclaimed, his voice carrying genuine surprise and excitement. "Dead center on the rock." Sarah felt a surge of disbelief and triumph that made her hands shake. She had just accomplished something that most people would consider impossible, hitting a dinner plate-sized target at a distance of nearly 2.5 miles. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake was grinning broadly as he looked up from the spotting scope. "Absolutely certain. That was a perfect shot." The magnitude of what she had accomplished began to sink in as they packed up the equipment. Sarah had not just made an extremely long shot. She had demonstrated a level of skill that put her in the company of elite military snipers. The shot would have been considered exceptional even for someone with years of specialized training. During the drive back down the mountain, Jake was unusually talkative, explaining that he had been testing her not just for marksmanship ability, but for the mental composure required for precision shooting under pressure. He revealed that he worked as a contractor for various government agencies, training snipers and evaluating potential recruits for specialized programs. "I've been looking for someone with your combination of technical skill and natural ability," Jake said as they reached the main road. "Someone who understands firearms at a fundamental level, but also has the mental discipline for extreme precision work." Sarah listened with growing amazement as Jake outlined opportunities she had never imagined. Private military companies employed civilian contractors for training roles, particularly those with expertise in long-range precision shooting. Equipment manufacturers needed consultants who could test and evaluate new products under field conditions. Law enforcement agencies required specialized training for their tactical teams. "The shot you made today proves you have capabilities that go far beyond normal marksmanship," Jake continued. "That kind of skill is rare, and it's valuable." Over the following weeks, Sarah's life began to change in ways she had never anticipated. Jake connected her with contacts in the precision shooting community, introducing her to competitions and training programs that existed at a level far beyond anything she had previously experienced. She began traveling to specialized shooting schools where she learned advanced techniques from former military snipers and elite marksmen. These programs taught her about equipment she had only heard about in conversations, ballistics calculations that required computer assistance, and shooting scenarios that challenged every aspect of her abilities. The workshop behind her father's gun shop became inadequate for her expanding knowledge and ambitions. Sarah invested in new equipment, including a precision rifle of her own and the sophisticated instruments needed for long-range ballistics calculations. Her reputation began to spread among serious precision shooters, and she found herself consulting on equipment purchases and training programs for clients from across the region. Within 6 months, Sarah had entered her first precision rifle competition at the national level. The event was held at a facility in Wyoming where competitors attempted shots at distances ranging from 600 to 1,600 meters. Drawing on the skills and confidence gained from her mountain experience with Jake, Sarah finished 3rd overall among 60 competitors, most of whom had military or law enforcement backgrounds. The competition results led to an invitation to join a civilian precision shooting team sponsored by a major firearms manufacturer. The team traveled to competitions throughout North America, testing equipment and demonstrating capabilities that showcased the latest developments in long-range shooting technology. Sarah discovered that her combination of technical knowledge from years of gunsmithing and natural shooting ability made her particularly valuable for equipment testing and development. Manufacturers wanted feedback from someone who understood both the mechanical aspects of firearms and the practical challenges of extreme precision shooting. A year after her first meeting with Jake, Sarah received an offer that would have seemed impossible when she was simply cleaning guns in her father's workshop. A defense contractor offered her a position as a civilian training instructor, teaching precision marksmanship to military and law enforcement snipers at a facility in Virginia. The decision to accept the position was not easy. It meant leaving Montana, leaving the family business that had been her entire life, and entering a world that was still predominantly male and military. But Sarah recognized that the opportunity represented a chance to use her skills at the highest possible level. Her father supported the decision with characteristic pragmatism. "You've always been too good for this small shop," he told her as she prepared to leave. "Go show them what a Montana girl can do." Sarah's new position involved training some of the most elite marksmen in the American military, teaching them techniques for shots at distances that pushed the boundaries of what was physically possible. The students she trained would deploy to locations around the world where their ability to make precise shots at extreme distances could be the difference between mission success and failure. The irony was not lost on her that what had begun as a simple encounter while cleaning a rifle in a small-town gun shop had led to a career training the most elite shooters in the world. Jake had recognized something in her that she had never fully understood about herself: the rare combination of technical expertise, natural ability, and mental discipline required for precision shooting at the highest level. Looking back on that day in the mountain meadow, Sarah realized that Jake had not just been testing her marksmanship. He had been evaluating whether she possessed the qualities needed to excel in a field where failure was not just disappointing, but potentially catastrophic. The shot at 3,800 meters had been as much about mental toughness and technical understanding as it had been about pulling the trigger. Years later, when Sarah trained new snipers in the advanced techniques of ultra-long-range precision shooting, she often thought about that moment when she had aimed what felt like impossibly far-off target and trusted in physics and mathematics to guide her bullet home. It had been a lesson in the importance of preparation, calculation, and confidence in one's abilities. The shot had changed everything, transforming her from a skilled but unknown gunsmith into one of the most respected precision shooting instructors in the country. It proved that exceptional ability could be found in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most significant opportunities came from the most ordinary circumstances. Sarah never forgot that it had all started with the simple act of cleaning guns and the arrival of a stranger who recognized potential that she had never fully realized herself. The 3,800-meter shot had been more than just an extreme test of marksmanship. It had been the beginning of a completely new life.